The rebuilding of the Temple Mount and its connection to biblical prophecy and the last days. That is what many have been discussing for a long time. And the theory goes that if the Temple Mount is rebuilt, it may or may not help usher in the return of the Messiah.
It's a key element of biblical prophecy involving the return of Jesus Christ to the earth, building a third temple in Jerusalem. Now there's a movement in Israel to make it happen, and it was made possible when Israel captured the Temple Mount during the Six-Day War in 1967.
Retaking this ground was important for a number of reasons. For one, it's where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple. After the Babylonians destroyed it, Zerubbabel laid the foundation stone for a second temple that was later expanded by King Herod. It fell at the hands of the Romans in 70 AD.
70 AD, this is a time that's huge in Jewish history. It's also huge in terms of the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures. Why? Because when we read our scriptures, we believe them to be early and earlier than 70 AD. Because if the scriptures were later, as some secular scholars would say, they would have talked about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So that is why a lot of us actually hold to, hey, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the majority of the epistles were written before 70 AD, closer to Jesus's life, around the time when there was eyewitnesses, right? So this connects to apologetics a bit in terms of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD.
When Commander Gore declared that the Temple Mount was back in Jewish hands, it rekindled hope for a long-awaited third temple.
The Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions and was a cataclysmic opening of a new era for Israel and for the whole world.
And again, those Christians who hold it to a predispensational view, it really was miraculous, the fact that they repeatedly fought so many wars to get Israel where it is today, right? And this entire Temple Mount situation is no exception to that.
Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute is dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish temple. He sees the time since the Six-Day War as a prophetic shift.
It would be hard, I think, not to see what's happened in the past 50 years as a tremendous jumpstart, a tremendous fast forward. It's more than prophetic. It's like a kiss from heaven, you know, it's like a divine kiss. It's an intimate brush with the reality of God's compassion and love, and he keeps his promises.
All of this means talk of rebuilding the temple is no longer considered a fringe idea.
Currently, the Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount. This is an Orthodox Jew, okay? The Orthodox Jews make up a huge constituency of the new government that was elected, okay? Netanyahu coming back, they're more conservative. By conservative, it means that they're more connected to these Orthodox Jewish types, okay? Now, this gets complicated, but many of the Orthodox Jews, they don't serve in the military, okay? They are not always celebrated or looked upon in a positive light by the secular Jews who do serve in the military. Remember, most men serve at least 3 years, women serve 2 years, okay? These folks have a way out. They don't have to serve because their service is Torah and praying, okay? And so what does that mean? That means that the conservative, not secular, but the conservative base of the government in Israel, Netanyahu and a lot of his cabinet, which is a huge controversial election, they create policies to allow these folks to not have to serve in the military, to give them more aid, social welfare aid, right? And allow them to go back and move towards praying again on the Temple Mount. When we were there, our Jewish guide could not go into the Temple Mount. They're not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, right? And so all of this stuff is intertwined and interconnected. So the theory could be that, if you want to be conspiratorial about it, is that after they take over Gaza, they will now have the desire, since if they wipe out the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, if they wipe them out, not the people, but the leadership, that they will have the precedent to then go and build the temple on the Temple Mount, which they currently aren't allowed to go to and pray. Now, let me give you guys some more of the geopolitical issues around it. This is a bit more geopolitical relevant, okay? Who owns the Temple Mount?
It's nearly impossible to summarize the Israeli-Palestinian conflict concisely, but if you're looking for the most potent symbol of the conflict, this place right behind me wins, hands down. Palestinians call it the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. Jews know it as the Temple Mount. It's the holiest site in Judaism and the third holiest site in Islam, which makes it some of the most contested real estate in the world.
The frustrating part is that the Muslims view this as their holy land because they think that Muhammad went to Jerusalem when Muhammad had a vision of going to Jerusalem. Okay, that's their claim for it, and then they conquered after the fact. They conquered Jerusalem after the fact, and then there was the response from the Crusaders to take Jerusalem back. The Roman Catholic Church Crusaders.
No place encapsulates Jerusalem's turbulent history quite like the Temple Mount, whose iconic golden dome has come to define the city skyline. This is where the stories and hopes and aspirations of three faiths converge. But if everyone claims it as their own, who does it really belong to? To answer that, we have to start at the beginning, and I mean the beginning. In Jewish tradition, the large flat stone in the middle of the Temple Mount complex is the center of the universe. This is where God breathed life into Adam, where Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, and where the Israelite King Solomon dedicated a temple to God 3,000 years ago.
Man, I got goosebumps him saying that. This is a very significant spot. Now, we know that the temple, as followers of Jesus, is God living in us, the Holy Spirit living in us, dwelling in us, right? But this place is still significant, especially to the Jewish people.
Temples were a dime a dozen in the ancient world, but not for the Jews, who had a single portable temple known as the Mishkan, which had been with them for hundreds of years since their wanderings in the desert after leaving Egypt. Solomon wanted to turn that portable temple into a permanent temple.
We would call this the Ark of the Covenant.
That could draw pilgrims from all over. See, at that time, the Israelites were the world's only monotheists, and their beautiful temple served as excellent PR for the one true God. So the king invested considerable resources to make the Jewish temple the destination for pilgrims of all nations. Solomon got his wish. Emperors and kings flocked to Jerusalem with offerings and gifts, and weapons, and imperial ambitions, and violence. For 400 years, Solomon's temple served as Judaism's focal point. Its fame extended to the distant corners of Europe and Africa. If Jerusalem was a prize situated at the crossroads of Asia and Africa, then the temple was its crown jewel. Here's the thing about prizes though, everyone wants one, including the Neo-Babylonians, who set their sights on Jerusalem in 6th century BCE. The Jews weren't jazzed about submitting to a larger empire, but the Neo-Babylonians didn't take kindly to being denied. They sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and hauled off huge numbers of Judeans into exile.
As the first destruction of the temple was by the Babylonians. This is when we're reading Ezekiel, when we're reading Jeremiah, when we're reading Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, okay? That is what they're talking about. This is that temple period, okay? So I love the passage in Jeremiah chapter 29. Many are like, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, right? Like that's in the context of them being exiled into Babylon, okay?
But then something amazing happened. The Persian ruler, Cyrus the Great, rose to power and allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. 71 years after the first temple's destruction, the second temple was open for business.
Now this is called the Second Temple period.
Like its predecessor, the second temple was magnificent, especially once the Roman puppet king Herod started expansions in the 1st century BCE. But Herod's renovations didn't last very long, because history repeats. Another empire had its eye on Judea. And just as they had before, the Jews refused to submit. So in 70 CE, the Romans borrowed from the Babylonian playbook, burning Jerusalem, destroying the temple, and deporting Judeans to Rome in chains.
So this is the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, this is when the Romans destroyed the temple. This is, Jesus prophesied this, okay? When he talks about, I will destroy this temple, right, and raise it in 3 days, he was talking about the temple being destroyed, but he was also talking about his own body and then that rising. And so that 70 AD is when this happened.
A final insult, the Romans used the Temple Mount as a garbage dump, literally. The Jews' holiest place, reduced for centuries to a heap of trash. All that was left of the once great temple included sections of the retaining walls. A small part of the western retaining wall became a site of Jewish pilgrimage and prayer, a symbol of both Jewish pride and Jewish tragedy. Why did Jews flock there? Why worship among refuse and ruins?
So that is called the Western Wall. Some kind of, jab at it and call it the Wailing Wall, because a lot of the Jews, when they're there, they're broken, they're somber, they're repentful, right? But that is the Western Wall that's outside of the Temple Mount. That's as close as the Jews can get to praying on the Temple Mount, is right outside.
Because it was never about the wall. The wall was merely the closest the Jews could get to the foundation stone,
That's right.
The holiest place on earth. So what changed? Who built this gorgeous dome behind me? That would be the Muslims. The holiest site in Islam is Mecca, which is a smooth 17-hour road trip if we get in the car right now. But the Prophet Muhammad didn't drive. According to Muslim tradition, he made the journey from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night on the back of a magical winged creature called the Burak.
So that made no sense. Oh, no.
So he had a magic carpet ride in one night because he said so. It's very likely that he never made it to Jerusalem himself.
And from there, he ascended to heaven to meet and pray with the other prophets. So yeah, this site is a big deal for Muslims too. Islam spread quickly through the Levant, and by the 7th century, the Holy Land was part of the growing Arab Empire. To commemorate Muhammad's night journey, the Ummah...
And so again, now Jerusalem, so it went from the Romans, now it's conquered by the Muslims, right?
The Caliph built this beautiful shrine behind me, right on top of where the Jewish temple's innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, had once stood. The center of the universe for Jews. The place where all three Abrahamic faiths agree that Abraham nearly sacrificed his son.
Ain't that crazy that all Muslims, Jews, and Christians all agree on that? That's kind of wild, right?
So who owns it now? Muslims or Jews? Like everything in the Middle East, it's complicated. Jews have been praying at the base of the Western Wall for 2,000 years. But as Jews returned to their homeland in the 1900s, Muslim authorities did their best to restrict Jewish access to the wall. Clerics whipped up their people with lies, claiming that the Jews were planning to take over and destroy Muslim holy sites. In August of 1929, after months of incitement, Arab mobs descended on the Jews of Jerusalem, Hebron, and Sfat. Over 133 Jews. The fight over this holy site has powered this conflict ever since. After Israel declared independence in May of 1948, the Arab world came calling, confident that they could stamp the tiny new state out of existence. As we know, they failed.
And this is where, again, when they say it's complicated, it's complicated. These were miraculous wars that Israel won. And Israel was not supposed to win these wars. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmanned, and they miraculously won against multiple nations repeatedly. And so you get into the United Nations saying, well, they violated this UN law, they violated this international law, and you start building the case in terms of the Palestinian people. But from Israel's perspective, they just took back what was theirs, and they repeatedly defended it over and over. And then they even gave some of the land back.
But the old city, including the Jewish quarter, fell to the Jordanians, who pointedly ignored that pesky clause in the ceasefire agreement that guaranteed Jews access to their religious sites. From 1948 to 1967, no Jew could approach the Western Wall.
Right. And then what happened?
All that changed when tensions exploded in 1967. The resulting war was brief, but it permanently altered the Middle East. Within 6 days, Israel dramatically expanded its borders and regained control of the old city. Within a week, 250,000 Jews had flocked to the wall. After 2,000 years of waiting, the Temple Mount was once again under Jewish control. Or was it? Muslims all over the world weren't too happy with the prospect of Jews controlling the Temple Mount. Plus, Jewish law has quite a lot to say about who's allowed to enter the complex and where they're allowed to go. Even in the days of the temples, ordinary Jews were barred from entering certain areas. This hadn't been an issue for 2,000 years. With the Temple Mount in Jewish hands once more, Israeli authorities had some decisions to make. The miraculous victory of 1967 had opened up a whole new world of complexity. Ultimately, Jewish tradition and Muslim pressure prevailed. And since 1967, Jews have not been allowed to pray on the Temple Mount.
Ain't that crazy? We could talk about how the Jews weren't always the most fair with the Palestinians and different neighborhoods being moved out and gentrification. All that. We can talk about that. But just stop and think for a minute. They won this war, took back control of the Temple Mount, and still were diplomatic because of the neighboring nations. Now, I'm not sure if this was the secular side of the Jewish military that was just like, look, like it's not worth the headache. I don't know what it was, but till this day, the Jews are not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount, which they control in Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting?
The mere hint of a change in the status quo can and has set the entire country ablaze.
And the status quo is, look, it's a messy situation. Yes, 100 years ago, there was only 10% of Jews here. Now Jews occupy 80% of the land. The UN and British created these weird boundaries. There was Arab people in what was Palestine 100 years ago. And so now we're going to keep this thing called the status quo for now. And like, just keep things as is. Don't ruffle the feathers, right? That's what the status quo is. Like it's a literal set of policies of like, look, we're not going to go over there. No Jews are going to walk on a Temple Mount like that. And let's just keep the status quo to status quo.
As I know all too well, Israeli forces can enter the Temple Mount at any time for security reasons. But control and maintenance of the site ultimately rests with a Jordanian-funded Muslim trust known as the Jerusalem Islamic Waqf, which means that Judaism's holiest site is under the third holiest site in Islam.
Ain't that crazy? Think about that for a second. So this whole like, you know, the Jews can just do whatever they want, and they've colonized Israel, yet they allow the land that they control, the Temple Mount that they control, they still allow the Muslims to run that part. And that's their third holiest site. This is the Jews' holiest site, but they're like, all right, you know what? We're going to play nice. We see according to the Bible that prayer is extremely important in terms of us being transformed from the inside out when we get aligned with God's will. I want you guys to implement these spiritual disciplines in your day-to-day life. And the only way I've been able to do this consistently is through writing down my prayers in a prayer journal that does a few things. One, it allows me to reflect and come to God humbly and ask him to move on my behalf. And 2, it allows me to document my prayers, which ultimately help me remember the very things that I was praying for and see the hand of God tangibly in my life when he answers them. So I would urge you, consider writing down your prayers. It could be in a blank notebook. It could even be on your phone. Or you could check out the one I personally designed and used from my own quiet time and spiritual discipline that I think will be a huge blessing. It's the exact structure and system that I've used for years to pray and be more consistent in my spiritual disciplines. And here's the thing, with the hope to create a prayer movement, we've made the PDF version of this prayer journal completely free. So to get the PDF of our prayer journal completely for free, go to blessgodpdf.shop now.